the next few days when the Cold War, quote unquote, heats up. And we're going to look at a few examples. We're going to look at the Cold War in Latin America, particularly. We're going to be looking at Guatemala. Then we're going to be looking at Cuba. And then we're going to be looking at Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia. So first, we're going to talk about the Cold War in Latin America. And you can kind of see my catchphrase here where the US gets maybe too involved. So the last time that we talked about Latin America was when they were getting their independence. And as Latin America is getting their independence at the beginning of the 1800s, most Latin American countries have received their independence from Spain by about 1825. And during that time, the United States issued what was called the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine was established in order to, right, there it is. The Monroe Doctrine was established in order to basically say, hey, Europe, you're done in the Americas. Don't come back, or the United States will see it as an act of war. At the beginning of the 1900s, right, we're kind of fast forwarding. The beginning of the 1900s, President Theodore Roosevelt, he issues what's called the Roosevelt Corollary. And the Roosevelt, let me spell that. Roosevelt Corollary. A corollary is an addition to a contract. And basically what the Roosevelt Corollary says is that the United States has the right to intervene in Latin American and Caribbean countries in order to, quote unquote, stabilize them. So we get to decide when Latin American countries need foreign intervention. So an interesting addition to the Monroe Doctrine, which said Europe couldn't intervene, but then it fixes it to say, oh, but the United States can, in fact, intervene. And as the shadow of the Cold War starts to spread across the world, a lot of this starts to fill itself out. So in terms of how the Roosevelt Corollary starts to be implemented during the Cold War, is very different. So the first thing I want to back up to the Great Depression and talk about the Great Depression in Latin America a little bit. So Latin America had established an export economy. So after they get their independence, 1825, they start to specialize in certain products. So you can see here what the products are. You can see a lot of bananas, for example, here. We can see some cattle, right? Beef. We can see rubber, right? They start to develop this export economy where they are exporting these specialized goods. This essentially establishes a very unequal distribution of wealth. There's not a big middle class. And what we start to see as well is that because of the Great Depression and the pressure is put, right, no one is getting any of these exports during the Great Depression. Because of this search for stability, like we saw in Europe, we see the rise of military dictatorships after the Great Depression. A lot of this is in response to the threat of communism. So just like we saw in Europe and Japan, communism. We're going to see a similar theme play out in Latin America. And because of this threat of communism and the growing popularity of communist ideology, because there isn't a big middle class, right? So communism is seen as much more appealing. The United States is going to end up supporting many military dictatorships in Latin America. Where we're going to be talking about is Guatemala. But first, we'll kind of talk about, right, this idea of dictator, like a whole book, Latin American Dictators of the 20th Century, the lives and regimes of 15 rulers. Oh, that's how many dictators there are in Latin America in the 20th century, that you can write a whole book about them, right? And when we look from 1900 to 1914, a one-party state or an oligarchy over much of Latin America. Only a few have a true multi-party system. Colombia and Uruguay. Venezuela, multiple regime changes, right? So fast forward to 2000, much of this has changed. So let's talk about Guatemala. Let's actually go back. right? So we can, no, I don't have it. All right, but Guatemala is up here. Okay. All right, so in Guatemala, in 1944, that's where we're going to check in. So during World War II, in 1944, the people of Guatemala overthrow a dictator and they establish a democracy. So in 1944, we have democracy established in Guatemala. Uh, One of the leaders who comes to power, we're going to fast forward a little bit to 1951. That man is Jacobo Arbenz. He is president of Guatemala in 1951. He starts to introduce things like a minimum wage and universal suffrage, right? The right to vote for everyone. He also starts to look at land reform. So, one of the big things to think about in 1951, this is during the Cold War. And one of the things that you can't really say without being accused of being a communist is land reform, this idea of redistribution of land. Um, but Arbenz wants to redistribute land. And the reason that he wants to do this is because 70% of the land in Guatemala is owned by banana plantations, particularly American owned banana plantations. And a lot of that land, even of the 70%, isn't even being cultivated. The banana companies just kind of bought it all up so that they could have it. So, what Arbenz suggests to the government is that they should seize some of this uncultivated land, land that's not having bananas grown on it, that these corporations own, and then they should sell it to the peasants so that the banana companies still get compensated for the land, but they can't like have this monopoly on all of the land. So think kind of how when we read about Cardenas in Mexico and how he wanted to nationalize or expropriate the oil companies, this is kind of what Arbenz wants to do with land, except he wants to actually compensate the banana companies for doing this. So the banana company that is the biggest problem for Arbenz is United Fruit Co. And United Fruit Co. is deeply upset by this plan to take their land. They see it as a communist threat. So, there's Jacobo Arbenz. So, United Fruit Co. essentially goes to the CIA, and the CIA and President Eisenhower. So here's President Eisenhower. Here is his Secretary of State. His Secretary of State is John Foster Dulles. They engineer a coup, a coup, which is an overthrow of the Arbenz government. So basically, the CIA bombs the capital of Guatemala City and blockade their ports. They do this, right, because they think that Arbenz is a communist and that he is going to basically become a satellite of the Soviet Union, and we can't have that in the Americas, right? The Roosevelt Corollary says that we have the right to intervene in order to quote unquote stabilize anywhere. After Arbenz is forced out by the overthrow organized by the CIA looks for this evidence that he was in communication with the Soviets, that he was planning on full redistribution of land. They call this like whole program PB History. Yeah. So that is the name of the CIA secret program. As they're going through, what they don't find is any evidence that Arbenz was working with the USSR. Or that he intended on full redistribution. What we find later on instead is that John Foster Dulles, in his youth, was one of the board members of the United Fruit Company. So I'll just let that sit there. He was one of their main lawyers before he goes to work for the government. And then he uses the government to help United Fruit. Interesting. So we don't have time to get into all of the other times that the United States overthrows democratically elected leaders in Latin America because of the Cold War, but here are a few. In 61, the United States backs the Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo. Trujillo was a real piece of work. He would actually have farmers and so on like bring him their daughters, and their daughters would like be forced to live with him. So there's that. After he is finally assassinated, if you're interested in finding out more of that, it's called In the Time of Butterflies. It's a great book. After he is assassinated, because he is finally assassinated, the U.S. sends 22,000 troops to help the military oust the new democratically elected president. Oops. In 64, Operation Brother Sam overthrows the president of Brazil. They install a military government that rules Brazil for 20 years. In 73, the United States creates the conditions for the coup overthrowing Salvador Allende in Chile. Augusto Pinochet, who is the dictator who gets put in place after that, we support him. And during his 16 years in power, 3,000 people are executed, 80,000 people are sent to internment camps, and tens of thousands are tortured by the government. In 75, we implement Operation Condor, which is a campaign of political repression and state-sponsored terror across the South American continent, and it's meant to eradicate communism. 60,000 people are killed because of it. In the 80s, we arm and support the Contras in Nicaragua, which are a collection of right-wing rebel groups fighting the socialist government. So, moral of the story. The spread of communism was so scary that the United States, the leader of the free world, the beacon of anti-imperialism and freedom of the speech and freedom of the press and freedom of speech, overthrows democracies. And we do this because we are so terrified by the threat of communism, right? We see communism as an existential threat, something that threatens the very existence of the United States. Because of that, our morals and our values get compromised, right? It becomes kind of a dark time in U.S. history.